Emily Schrader, columnist, Jerusalem Post, is with me today. Thank you so much, Emily, for coming on the broadcast again. In your latest article on Jerusalem Post, you said international media has failed to expose the people who are actively working against the protesters in Iran. Can you tell us more?
Yeah, so first of all, thanks so much for having me back. It's a pleasure to be here and to be speaking with you again. In regards to the latest article, yes, one of the trends that I've seen in international media, particularly in English-speaking media, is that a lot of the pundits and the figures that they have speaking about what's happening in Iran are affiliated in some capacity, sometimes formally, with the Iran regime's lobby in the United States and Canada, which is also known as NIAC, NIAC. This group is known for having very reformist views when it comes to the issues of the Islamic regime. They've spoken out for sanction relief repeatedly. They supported the JCPOA, the Iran deal, even when it was a bad deal for all the parties involved, except, of course, the Iranian Islamic regime. So there are a lot of questionable statements and figures who are associated with this organization, and yet their figures keep popping up again and again and again as so-called experts on what's happening in Iran. So this is highly suspect. I looked into it a little bit more, and that's when I discovered that basically this is in a way, an arm of the Islamic regime and the way that they're trying to frame and twist these protests in the West.
So do you think, is this why the government maybe are confused with saying what is happening now in Iran?
I mean, I think that the concerted effort for disinformation that's coming from groups like NIAC definitely does make it more difficult for elected officials, especially elected officials who this isn't their main issue. You know, they don't focus on international issues. They focus mostly on domestic issues. And yet they still are a part of the decision making at the government level, be it the European Parliament or the US Congress or the Canadian Congress. So this touches all elected officials. And if they're not looking closely, it may sound like to them, based on the people who are speaking about this issue, in particular in English, that the issue here is really just one of hijab or of women's rights, or as Farnaz Fasihi wrote in the New York Times, which actually ended up, bringing about a protest against the New York Times outside their offices. She wrote that this was purely economic motivated. And her conclusion to this, of course, is that the United States and Western powers should reduce sanctions at a time like this, which of course is absolutely obscene, because sanction relief, even though sanctions do make it more difficult for many Iranian people, sanction relief doesn't mean any more money is going into the Iranian economy. It means more money is going into the hands of the mullahs and the Islamic regime and no one else. And anybody who's considering sanction relief needs to understand that first and foremost, be it people on the ground watching TV or elected officials.
In one of videos you share on social media, you condemn lack of enough or fair coverage of a nationwide protest in Iran compared to 24/7 coverage of Russia's war in Ukraine or Afghanistan. Do you see this as a double standard?
Of course, I see this as a double standard. I mean, I'm an Israeli American myself, and I'm very familiar with media bias the other way. Israel often experiences completely disproportionate coverage against Israel. And yet when it comes to an issue like this, when the Iranian people have been under this oppressive regime for 43 years, they're rising up. They're not calling for reform. They're calling for regime change. That's very, very clear from everybody on the ground, from all different classes and groups within Iranian society. And yet there's very little coverage of this perspective of what the people actually want on the ground in the international media. For sure, this is a double standard. The way that this has been covered, especially from places like Al Jazeera English, for example. I looked just a couple days ago, their entire English website, all the way down from top to bottom, not a single article about what's happening in Iran. Not even one. Now, I know that they have had stories about it here or there, but compare that to what's happening with Ukraine and Russia. Compare that to what happened even with Afghanistan. And of course, compare that to how Al Jazeera talks about Israel obsessively. There's no comparison. This is absolutely a double standard, and it needs to stop.
Why do you think is that?
I mean, I think that there are different interests for different parties. Some of the parties, such as Al Jazeera, may want these protests to sort of go away without any significant regime change. Of course, there are A lot of people who say that this is related to oil, and some European countries don't want to pull back direct relations with Iran because of that. I don't know if there's truth to any of those, but I do know what I'm seeing on the ground when it comes to the media, and that is that there is a definite double standard when it comes to reporting these protests. And then additionally, the people who you have who are, reporting or supposed to be reporting about it, like the New York Times, are doing a really bad job. And in fact, they're sometimes intentionally misrepresenting what the core point and the core goals of these protests, which are actually a revolution, what the goals of this revolution are.
Emily, I know you're in touch with many Iranians, many of them asking you on your social media, now that we are on the streets risking our lives, Israel is not supporting us. How do you think Israeli government can support these protesters? They're asking for something more than just moral support.
Sure. So I'm a private citizen. I can't speak to the Israeli government's policy, what they're doing, what they have done, or what they will do. I really don't know. I think at this point, Israel also has to consider their own security. From day one, Israel has been very active in combating the Iranian proxies, obviously, that threaten Israel, such as Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and also Hezbollah in Lebanon and also Syria, as well as IRGC bases and IRGC officials who are in Syria. There have been several airstrikes that we know were coming from Israel. In terms of what's happening on the ground, we really don't know how, if Israel is helping or in what capacity they're helping. But as a private citizen, I do hope that Israel steps up and is able to help the people of Iran in whatever way possible, technologically or otherwise. I am hopeful that that is the case. Don't know if it is.